The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet town of Lexington, Alabama. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets had a way of slipping through the cracks if you weren't careful. The townspeople gathered at the First Baptist Church every Sunday, their voices rising together in a harmonious chorus of faith. And at the center of it all stood Reverend Jacob Montgomery, a tall man with a strong, commanding presence. His voice, deep and steady, carried easily through the sanctuary, comforting his congregation with promises of salvation and eternal life. But beneath the Reverend's pious exterior lay a mind capable of dark, devious thoughts. Thoughts that no one would ever imagine could belong to the man who led their prayers each week. His wife, Emily Montgomery, was a gentle soul, known for her grace and kindness. A petite woman with soft brown eyes and an ever-present smile, Emily had been a constant source of support for her husband. They had been married for over 20 years, a union forged through faith and shared dreams. They lived in a modest, well-kept house on the outskirts of town, the perfect picture of a happy, devout couple. But as the years passed, Emily's health began to deteriorate. First, it was the chronic pain in her legs. Doctors diagnosed her with a rare condition that caused severe circulation problems, making her legs swell and ache unbearably. The pain grew worse with each passing month, and no amount of medication seemed to help. Emily, ever the trooper, continued to smile through it all. But those closest to her could see that the woman they once knew was slowly slipping away. It was during one of these painful episodes that Jacob Montgomery hatched a plan, one that would change both their lives forever. He had always been a man of ambition, his hunger for success never fully satisfied by the modest life he had. When Emily's health took a turn for the worse, Jacob saw an opportunity. He knew that Emily's medical condition could lead to a significant insurance payout, $2.5 million to be exact, if she were to lose her legs. The thought of that money, that fortune, made Jacob's pulse quicken. With that kind of money, he could finally break free from the shackles of his small-town life. He could live the life he had always dreamed of, a life of luxury and power. But Emily, loving and trusting, would never agree to something as drastic as amputations. That was the obstacle Jacob faced. He needed to convince her that the only way to save her was by sacrificing her legs. He was a preacher, after all, a man of God. He knew how to speak in ways that would make anyone believe, especially someone as devoted as Emily. It started with gentle encouragement, as if he were only looking out for her best interests. He told her that the doctors had suggested an amputation might be the only way to save her life, that without it, her condition could worsen and eventually take her life. At first, Emily hesitated, unsure of what to do. She loved her legs, loved the feeling of walking, the freedom it gave her. But the pain was becoming unbearable. She trusted her husband and, more than anything, wanted to get better. So when Jacob told her that the amputation could give her a chance at a pain-free life, she was swayed. The promise of healing and a fresh start seemed to outweigh the fear of losing her limbs. Jacob was careful, patient. He made sure she was emotionally vulnerable, waiting until she was in the midst of one of her most painful flare-ups before suggesting the idea. He painted a picture of a future where Emily could live without constant agony. He convinced her that it was the only option, the only way forward. The decision was made. Emily, with a heavy heart, agreed to the amputation. She had no idea that her husband, the man she trusted above all others, was orchestrating her downfall. Jacob wasted no time. He arranged for a renowned surgeon to perform the operation, convincing Emily that the procedure would change her life for the better. He made sure all the details were in place: the hospital stay, the recovery process, and most importantly, the insurance policy. It was all so easy. Jacob had carefully maneuvered the situation, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. He had Emily right where he wanted her. As the day of the surgery approached, Jacob's excitement grew. Soon he would have his hands on the $2.5 million payout, and with it, he could leave this town behind for good. The thought of it made him giddy, and he couldn't help but smile to himself, already planning how he would spend the money. But there was one thing Jacob hadn't counted on: Detective Maggie Lawson. Maggie had been a seasoned investigator for over 15 years. She had seen it all: the greed, the deception, and the betrayal. She had worked on cases involving embezzlement, murder, and everything in between. But there was something about the Montgomery case that caught her attention. It wasn't the amputation or the insurance money. It was the way Jacob Montgomery carried himself. There was something off about him, something that didn't sit right with her. Maggie had been called to investigate the case when Emily's tragic death occurred shortly after the surgery. At first, it seemed like an unfortunate accident. The amputation had been successful, but complications during recovery led to a fatal infection. That was the official story. But Maggie's gut told her there was more to it. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something behind the scenes that no one was seeing, something that didn't add up. As she dug deeper into the case, Maggie began to uncover the dark web of lies Jacob had woven around his wife's suffering. She would soon learn just how far he was willing to go for money and how his web of deception would ultimately lead to murder. The investigation had begun. Detective Maggie Lawson sat at her desk in the small, dimly lit office at the Lexington Police Department. The hum of the overhead lights was the only sound in the otherwise quiet room. She was still in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a steely demeanor that made criminals nervous. Over the years, she had grown accustomed to the routine of small-town cases, petty theft, domestic disturbances, the occasional DUI. But every now and then, a case would come across her desk that felt different. This was one of those cases. Maggie had read through the report on Emily Montgomery's death multiple times, but something about it didn't sit right with her. The story had all the markings of a tragic, albeit ordinary accident. A woman undergoing a routine amputation to relieve chronic pain, only for complications to arise during recovery. The official cause of death was sepsis, a severe infection that set in after the surgery. But Maggie was a professional, and professionals didn't take things at face value. Emily Montgomery was a sweet woman, from what everyone in town had said, and she had been devoted to her church, her family, and most of all, to her husband Jacob. Jacob, the respected reverend of the First Baptist Church, was well liked by the community. He was charismatic, charming even, and known for his seemingly boundless energy and compassion. On the surface, the Montgomerys appeared to be the ideal couple. But Maggie's gut told her that behind the polished exterior, there was something darker lurking in the shadows. The first step in Maggie's investigation was to visit the hospital where the surgery had been performed. She needed to review the medical records, anything that could shed light on Emily's condition and the nature of the amputation. Maggie wasn't an expert on medical procedures, but she had worked enough cases to know that it was possible for something to go wrong during a routine operation, especially when patients had pre-existing conditions. What struck her as odd, though, was the fact that Emily had been in relatively good health before the amputation. Yes, the pain in her legs had been bad, but she wasn't the type of patient to be on death's doorstep. Maggie arrived at Lexington Memorial Hospital just as the afternoon shift was ending. She made her way to the office of Dr. Howard Collins, the surgeon who had performed the amputation. Dr. Collins was a seasoned professional, known for his expertise in complex surgeries, and had come highly recommended. But Maggie needed to hear his side of the story. She needed to understand exactly what had happened in the operating room, and what he knew about Emily's health prior to the surgery. Dr. Collins was a tall, middle-aged man with a neat beard and round glasses. He greeted Maggie with a polite smile, but she could tell from the way his eyes darted around the room that he was nervous. "Detective Lawson, I assume you're here about Mrs. Montgomery?" Dr. Collins asked, his voice steady, but there was an underlying tension that Maggie couldn't ignore. "That's right, doctor. I need to understand what happened during the surgery and the recovery process," Maggie said, sitting down across from him. She could feel the weight of the investigation starting to settle into her chest, but she pushed it aside. She had a job to do. Dr. Collins nodded, running a hand through his hair. It was a difficult procedure, no doubt. Emily Montgomery had a rare condition, arterial insufficiency in her lower extremities. It had been progressively worsening over the last few years. The pain she was experiencing was severe, and her mobility was becoming increasingly limited. We'd explored other options, but in the end, the only solution that could save her life was the amputation. Unfortunately, complications arose. Sepsis set in during her recovery. We did everything we could to combat it, but the infection spread quickly and she passed away. Maggie's mind raced as she listened, picking apart every word, every detail. The facts matched the official report so far, but she knew better than to take things at face value. There was a layer of truth beneath the surface that needed to be uncovered. "Did you ever have any concerns about the procedure?" Maggie asked, leaning forward slightly. "Anything unusual about her medical history that you think could have contributed to the complications?" Dr. Collins hesitated for a moment, his fingers drumming nervously on the edge of the desk. "No, not really. There were some concerns about her circulation, of course, but that was part of why we recommended the surgery in the first place. There was some risk, but nothing that would have indicated this level of complication. I don't know why she died, Detective. It just, it just doesn't make sense." Maggie could see that he was being truthful. He wasn't hiding anything, at least not in the medical records. She thanked Dr. Collins and left his office, her thoughts swirling with the new information. The surgery had gone as expected. Emily's condition had been critical, but there were no red flags in the way the procedure had been conducted. So if the medical side was above board, that left only one other avenue to explore: Jacob Montgomery. Jacob had been the one to make the decision for Emily to undergo the amputation. He had been with her every step of the way, offering support and encouragement. The question Maggie needed to answer now was simple. Did Jacob Montgomery stand to benefit from his wife's death? To begin answering that question, Maggie went to the town's insurance agent, Mark Hughes, who handled the Montgomery's policies. Mark was a friendly man in his late 50s, with a thick southern drawl that made everything he said sound a little slower, a little more deliberate. He had been in the business for decades and knew the ins and outs of every policy in the county. "I understand that Emily Montgomery had a significant life insurance policy. Can you tell me about it?" Maggie asked. Mark pulled up the information on his computer and handed her a printout. "Yeah, she had a policy worth $2.5 million. A fairly standard life insurance policy, but with a rider for accidental death. I remember Jacob was very specific about that. He wanted to make sure that if something happened to her, accident or otherwise, he would be taken care of financially." Maggie's eyes narrowed. "Accidental death?" she repeated. "You're saying this policy covered something like that?" Mark nodded. "That's right. It's not uncommon. People want to make sure their families are protected, you know." Jacob was insistent on it, very meticulous when it came to the details of the policy. Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Jacob Montgomery had arranged the amputation. His wife's life hung in the balance, and now, after her death, he would receive $2.5 million. The timing was too perfect, too convenient. But there was one thing that Maggie knew. Jacob Montgomery was a man of faith, a preacher in a small town. The townspeople revered him. If he had orchestrated this, it would be hard to prove. The trust people had in him would make any investigation more difficult, especially if he was as careful as she suspected. Maggie had to dig deeper. The more she learned, the more she realized that this was no ordinary case. This was something far more insidious, a crime of manipulation, greed, and betrayal. And it was her job to uncover the truth. The sun had set, casting the town of Lexington into an orange hue as Detective Maggie Lawson sat in her car, parked on a quiet street not far from the Montgomery home. The night air was cool, and the steady hum of cicadas filled the silence around her. She glanced at the folder on the passenger seat, the case file she had been poring over for hours. The more she delved into Emily Montgomery's death, the more tangled the web became. The $2.5 million insurance policy, the sudden decision for the amputation, Jacob Montgomery's role as her caregiver. It all seemed too perfect, too rehearsed. Maggie was used to the fine details of investigations, the small signs that criminals often overlooked. But this case had something different, something sinister. She thought back to her conversation with Mark Hughes, the insurance agent. The details about the accidental death rider on Emily's policy were crucial. If something had happened to Emily during the surgery that could have been deemed an accident, Jacob would walk away with a substantial sum. But Emily's condition had been worsening for years, and it seemed unlikely that an amputation, one that was deemed medically necessary, would fall under the category of an accident unless someone had manipulated the situation. Maggie's instincts told her that the timing of Emily's death was no coincidence. The infection that killed her could have been preventable. If she had been receiving the right aftercare, if her husband had been more vigilant during the recovery process, if. But none of that could be proven without more evidence. She needed to speak with more people who knew the Montgomerys well, people who could offer insight into Jacob's behavior, his character, and whether he had ever shown signs of cruelty, manipulation, or greed. Maggie was certain that the truth was buried somewhere beneath the surface. That was when she decided to visit some of the church members who had known the Montgomerys for years. The First Baptist Church was the heart of the town, and if there were any whispers about Jacob's behavior or his relationship with Emily, they would be found there. The next morning, Maggie arrived at the church just before the midday service. It was a large brick building with tall stained glass windows and a massive bell tower that could be seen from nearly every corner of the town. The parking lot was nearly full, the sound of congregants chatting in the courtyard filling the air as people prepared for the service. Maggie spotted a few familiar faces, locals who had attended church for years. She approached a woman in her late 60s, Mrs. Clara Thompson, a longtime member of the church who had been close to Emily. Clara was standing by the entrance, chatting with a group of women. She was a petite, wiry woman with silver hair tied up in a bun. Her eyes sparkled with the kind of energy that only years of faith and community involvement could bring. "Excuse me, Mrs. Thompson, can I talk to you for a moment?" Maggie asked, stepping closer. Clara turned, a smile crossing her face. "Detective Lawson, of course. What can I help you with?" Maggie introduced herself and briefly explained the purpose of her visit, asking if she could speak with Clara about the Montgomerys. At first, Clara seemed reluctant, but after a moment, she agreed to sit down with Maggie in the small room off the main hall, where the church held meetings and gatherings. "I don't know what you're hoping to find, Detective," Clara began once they were seated. "The Montgomerys were always so kind, always seemed like the perfect couple. Jacob was a wonderful preacher, and Emily was one of the sweetest souls you'd ever meet. She was kind to everyone, always asking how others were doing. She never let on that anything was wrong. If there were any issues, she kept them to herself." Maggie's curiosity was piqued. She had heard this before, people speaking highly of Jacob and Emily, offering nothing but praise. But Maggie knew there was more to the story. "Did you ever notice anything odd about their relationship? Anything that seemed off about Jacob, the way he treated Emily?" Clara paused, a cloud of uncertainty crossing her face. "Well, now that you mention it, there was something that always bothered me. It's not something I ever spoke about, but Jacob was always a bit controlling. He'd keep a close eye on Emily, make sure she was always by his side during church events. And if anyone else tried to approach her, he'd get a little protective. I wouldn't say aggressive, but he always made sure he was the one calling the shots when it came to her health." Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. This was the first sign of something out of the ordinary. Clara continued, her voice dropping slightly. "There were times when Emily seemed tired, worn out even. She'd confide in me sometimes about the pain in her legs, but she'd always brush it off. She didn't want to worry anyone, but I could tell she was struggling. And Jacob always made it seem like everything was under control. He'd tell her what to do, what not to do. I don't know, Detective. I just thought maybe it was the pressure of being in the public eye all the time." Maggie's mind was racing now. Clara's words were like puzzle pieces falling into place. Jacob had controlled every aspect of Emily's life, even down to her health, and now he was controlling the narrative of her death. The more Maggie thought about it, the more it made sense. Jacob had carefully crafted a situation where Emily's tragic death would seem like a result of her medical condition, and the insurance payout would be a windfall. All the while, he kept a tight grip on his wife's actions, making sure that no one saw through the facade. "Did Emily ever mention anything about Jacob's financial situation?" Maggie asked. "Was there ever talk of money, especially when it came to her health?" Clara looked uncomfortable. "Well, there was talk, more like whispers, really. You know how people are in this town. They talk. A few months before the surgery, I overheard a conversation between Jacob and Emily about money. Jacob was very adamant that the insurance policy be updated. He wanted it to be comprehensive. He even told her that if something happened to her, it would be for the best. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured he meant it in the sense that Emily wouldn't have to suffer anymore. But now that you mention it, it sounds strange. Maggie felt her stomach tighten. Jacob's words were beginning to take on a more sinister meaning. Clara's testimony had just opened a whole new door in the investigation. The idea that Jacob had been so focused on the insurance policy that he had used Emily's suffering as a means to secure his future was starting to look more and more like a calculated move. But Maggie needed more. She needed solid proof, something to back up these suspicions. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," Maggie said, standing up. "I'm going to need to look into this further. Your words have been very helpful." Clara nodded but looked concerned. "I hope you're right, Detective. I hope this is just a misunderstanding. Jacob has always been good to this town, but I've learned not to ignore my gut." As Maggie left the church, she couldn't shake the feeling that Clara had just scratched the surface of something far more twisted than she could have imagined. Jacob Montgomery, the charming preacher, had manipulated not just his wife's suffering, but the entire town's trust. Now it was time to pull at the threads of his carefully woven lie. The truth was out there, and Maggie was determined to find it. Maggie spent the next several days following a trail of breadcrumbs, each piece of information leading her deeper into the murky waters of Jacob Montgomery's life. The more she uncovered, the more apparent it became. This was no ordinary case. There was something deliberate, even calculated, about the way Jacob had manipulated Emily's suffering and death. Maggie could feel the weight of the investigation bearing down on her, but she remained determined to find the truth, no matter how far it took her. The interview with Mrs. Clara Thompson had been a breakthrough. Clara's account of Jacob's controlling behavior, his obsessive need to keep Emily by his side, and his strange conversations about the insurance policy had given Maggie the first real glimpse of the darker side of the preacher. But it wasn't enough to charge him, yet. Maggie needed to gather more evidence, something concrete that would prove Jacob's involvement in his wife's death. Maggie returned to the Montgomery household. It was a large two-story home on the edge of town, perched on a small hill with a view of the surrounding woods. The house looked like something out of a storybook, well kept, with a white picket fence, flower boxes in the windows, and a neatly trimmed lawn. From the outside, it appeared to be a picture of suburban bliss, the ideal home of a loving family. But Maggie knew better. The moment she stepped inside, she was greeted by an eerie silence. The house seemed colder than it should have been, as though the warmth of the family that had once lived here had been slowly drained away. Jacob was at his desk in the study, the door half open, deep in conversation with someone on the phone. He looked up as Maggie entered, his face breaking into a practiced smile. "Detective Lawson," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "What brings you by today?" Maggie studied him for a moment. He was dressed in a dark suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his hair neatly combed. There was nothing about his appearance that gave away the cold calculation she had begun to suspect. On the surface, he was the charming, well-dressed preacher the town adored. But underneath, Maggie sensed a man who had mastered the art of deception. "I'm here to ask a few more questions, Reverend," Maggie said, keeping her tone professional. "About Emily. I'm still gathering information, trying to understand exactly what happened during her recovery." Jacob set the phone down and stood, offering a hand. "Of course, anything I can do to help. Emily's death has been devastating for me, Detective. I'm still in shock, to be honest." Maggie shook his hand, maintaining eye contact. "I understand. I just need a bit more information about the events leading up to her surgery and the days after." Jacob nodded and gestured for Maggie to sit. "You're welcome to ask anything, Detective. I'm an open book." The words sounded rehearsed, too practiced. Maggie sat, her mind racing as she prepared for what she needed to ask next. She needed to push him, to see if there was a crack in his perfect facade. "Can you tell me who made the final decision about Emily's surgery?" Maggie asked, watching his face closely. "Was it you, or did she have input in the decision?" Jacob's expression faltered for just a moment, a brief hesitation that was almost imperceptible. but Maggie noticed it. "Well, Emily and I discussed it at length, of course," he began, his voice steady. "It was a decision we both came to together. Emily was in so much pain, Detective. It was heartbreaking to watch. She was struggling, and the doctors told us that amputation was the only way to save her. I only wanted what was best for her, just as any loving husband would." Maggie's instincts screamed at her, but she pushed forward. "But you were the one who arranged the surgery? You were the one who pushed for the amputation?" Jacob paused, a flicker of discomfort crossing his features before he regained his composure. "I don't know if pushed is the right word. I made sure everything was in order. I spoke with the surgeon, made sure the insurance was up to date, but ultimately Emily made the final decision. I only wanted to support her." Maggie's eyes narrowed. "And after the surgery, how did she recover? Were there any complications during her recovery process?" Jacob's gaze shifted just slightly, but it was enough for Maggie to notice. "Emily had some trouble with the recovery, yes, but nothing too unexpected. The doctors were monitoring her closely, and I was there by her side the entire time. We were doing everything we could." Maggie leaned forward slightly. "And yet, she died from an infection. Wasn't that unusual for someone in her condition?" "The surgery was straightforward, wasn't it?" Jacob's jaw clenched for a brief moment, but he quickly masked it with a sad smile. "It was. It was a routine procedure. Unfortunately, the infection spread faster than anyone anticipated. The doctors did their best, but sometimes these things happen. It's the nature of the disease she had. There's nothing more I could have done." Maggie didn't believe a word of it. She had heard enough to know that Jacob was hiding something, something important. His attempts to deflect, his choice of words, the subtle body language, it was all part of the mask he wore for the world. But Maggie was determined to see behind it. She stood up, her mind already working through the next step of her investigation. "Thank you for your time, Reverend. I may need to follow up with you again, but for now I think I've gathered everything I need." Jacob stood as well, his smile never faltering. "Of course, Detective. I'll be here if you need anything else." As Maggie left the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that Jacob had just given her a glimpse into his true nature. He was calm, too calm, almost robotic in his responses. It was clear to her now that Jacob Montgomery had not only orchestrated Emily's death, but had also planned it with the precision of a master manipulator. Everything about his behavior screamed guilt, but Maggie knew that she needed more than just a hunch. She needed undeniable proof. The next step was clear. She needed to dig deeper into Jacob's financial records. Maggie spent the next few days tracking down every bank account, every transaction, every asset Jacob had access to. She started with the insurance policies. Everything Emily had signed, everything Jacob had pushed for. The more she looked into it, the more she realized just how deeply Jacob had embedded himself in Emily's finances. He had pushed for the life insurance policy, but more than that, he had made sure that the payout would be substantial if something happened to her. He had made sure the doctors recommended the surgery, all while presenting himself as the concerned, loving husband. But there was something more, a series of bank transfers that didn't sit right with Maggie. Jacob had recently transferred large sums of money to an offshore account. The amounts were significant enough to raise red flags. Maggie pulled up the name of the account holder. It was registered under a false name, one that Maggie traced back to a man who had disappeared over a decade ago, a man with a criminal record tied to fraud and money laundering. This was it. Jacob Montgomery hadn't just manipulated Emily's death for the insurance money. He had been laundering money through her. The $2.5 million wasn't just about his wife's life. It was about a much larger scheme, one that stretched far beyond the small-town preacher he portrayed himself as. Jacob Montgomery was a man with secrets, dark, dangerous secrets, and Maggie was determined to bring him down. The morning after Maggie uncovered the bank transfer records, she couldn't shake the sense that she was standing at the edge of something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. Jacob Montgomery's life, carefully crafted to project the image of a pious, humble preacher, had now crumbled into something far darker, a web of deceit, manipulation, and financial crime. And the more Maggie dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about Emily's death. It was about Jacob's grand scheme, one that had been years in the making. She had traced the money to an offshore account linked to a man named Robert Bobby Langley, a name that triggered a memory in her mind. Langley wasn't a man she had ever encountered personally, but she had read about him. He had disappeared from Lexington over a decade ago after being accused of large-scale financial fraud and money laundering. There had been rumors that he had connections to some dangerous people, and after his disappearance, the case had gone cold. But now, as Maggie sat in her office, the pieces of the puzzle clicked together. Jacob Montgomery had been laundering money through Emily's life insurance policy, and the account under Langley's name was the key to unlocking the rest of the story. Maggie knew she needed to confront Jacob, but she wasn't going to make the same mistake as before, approaching him with nothing but a hunch. She had solid evidence now: the money, the fraudulent offshore account, and the connections to Robert Langley. It was time to make her move. She spent the next few hours compiling a report, cross-referencing every detail, making sure that everything was backed by hard evidence. She knew that if she was going to take down a man as skilled in deception as Jacob Montgomery, she needed to be precise, thorough, and above all, confident. By mid-afternoon, she had everything she needed. The next step was to get the local authorities involved and gather enough support to bring Jacob in for questioning. But before she did that, Maggie wanted one final look at the man behind the mask. That evening, Maggie drove to the Montgomery household once more. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. She parked her car a little farther down the road this time, keeping a low profile as she observed the house. Jacob's black SUV was parked in the driveway, but there was no sign of Emily's car. She had been gone for weeks now, but the house still felt eerily lived in, as though Jacob were waiting for her to come back. Maggie stood for a moment, taking in the sight of the home. The pristine lawn, the white picket fence, the flowers in the window boxes. Everything about it screamed normality. It was the kind of house that on the surface made you believe that everything was fine, that the Montgomerys were the epitome of wholesome, God-fearing people. But Maggie knew better now. Beneath the surface, there was a dark reality that no one had been able to see, and Jacob Montgomery was at the center of it all. She walked up to the front door and rang the bell, her heart pounding in her chest. She had rehearsed what she would say, but now that she was here, standing on the porch of the house where Emily had spent her final days, the gravity of the situation hit her all over again. Jacob answered the door almost immediately, his usual calm demeanor in place, but Maggie could see the faintest hint of nervousness in his eyes. Just a flicker that lasted a second, but it was enough. "Detective Lawson," he said, his voice polite but cool. "I wasn't expecting you. Is everything all right?" Maggie met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "I need to speak with you, Reverend Montgomery. This can't wait." Jacob stepped aside, allowing her into the foyer. The house smelled faintly of incense and polished wood, the kind of scent one might associate with a church. It was almost as if Jacob was trying to set a tone to maintain the illusion of sanctity. Maggie knew better. "I have some new questions for you, Reverend," she said, her eyes scanning the hallway. It was spotless, too spotless, almost like a showroom. The walls were adorned with family pictures of Jacob and Emily, of church events, of their life together. It all felt like a carefully curated gallery designed to present a flawless image. Jacob led her into the living room, his movements smooth, practiced. As they sat down, Maggie couldn't help but notice how much control he still exerted over the space, over their interaction. He was calm, composed, but there was something in his eyes now, a flicker of uncertainty. "I've come across some disturbing information, Reverend," Maggie began, her voice low and steady. "I've been looking into your finances. I'm sure you're aware that Emily had a life insurance policy, a significant one. What I've found, though, is something I didn't expect." Jacob's expression remained neutral, but Maggie saw his fingers twitching ever so slightly, as if the words were starting to land. "You've been moving large sums of money into an offshore account, an account that's registered under a false name. The name is Robert Langley, a man who disappeared from Lexington over a decade ago, and I'm guessing you know him well. You've been using Emily's insurance policy to launder money through that account. This wasn't just about Emily's death, was it? It was about a much larger operation." Jacob's face hardened, his hands clasping together in his lap. "Detective, you're mistaken," he said, his voice taking on an edge. "I don't know what you're talking about. Everything I've done for the right reasons. Emily's death was a tragedy, yes, but it was an accident, an unfortunate complication." Maggie leaned in, her eyes never leaving his. "I don't think you understand, Jacob. I've got everything I need to put this together. Your financial records, the offshore accounts, and the connection to Langley. You were behind this from the very beginning. You manipulated Emily's death to gain access to that insurance payout, and you used her suffering to cover up your money laundering operation." Jacob's calm facade finally cracked. His jaw clenched and his eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. The silence between them was thick with tension, but Maggie could feel the shift. The game was up. "You're not the man you've pretended to be for all these years," she continued, her voice hard. "You're no preacher. You're a fraud, a liar, and a murderer. And I'm going to make sure you pay for what you've done." Jacob stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He took a step toward Maggie, his face twisted with a mix of rage and fear. For a moment it seemed like he might lash out, but he stopped himself, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He straightened his tie, his voice cold. "You think you can bring me down with your accusations? I've built this town, detective. I've helped people. You're just a small-town cop trying to make a name for yourself." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Maggie stood unfazed. "I think I've got it all figured out, Jacob, and you're going to answer for your crimes." As she turned to leave, Jacob didn't stop her. But Maggie knew that this was only the beginning. The investigation wasn't over. There was still work to be done. But now she had Jacob Montgomery exactly where she wanted him. Maggie spent the next few days preparing herself for the storm that was coming. Jacob Montgomery had finally shown his true colors, but he was far from the only player in this twisted drama. His cold demeanor and calculated lies had only confirmed what she had suspected. Jacob was a master manipulator who had carefully orchestrated his wife's death and used her suffering as a means to cover his financial crimes. As the days wore on, Maggie's team worked tirelessly, gathering every piece of evidence they could find to build the strongest case possible against Jacob. Every transaction, every email, every connection to Robert Langley, everything began to fall into place. But it was clear that this wasn't going to be a simple arrest. Jacob Montgomery had friends in high places, and Maggie knew that he would fight back with everything he had. One particular morning, Maggie was sitting in her office, going over the case files when she got an unexpected call. It was Sheriff Tom Keller, the man who had known Jacob Montgomery for years, someone who had once considered him a pillar of the community. Maggie had always felt that Keller was a little too close to the Montgomerys, but this call was unexpected. "Maggie, you got a minute?" Keller asked, his voice low. "Of course, Sheriff. What's going on?" Keller hesitated, the sound of shuffling papers coming from the other end of the line. "I think we need to talk. Meet me at the diner. We need to discuss something, and I don't want it to get out just yet." Maggie felt a knot form in her stomach. She didn't like the sound of this, but she knew she had to go. Something was off, and Keller's sudden urgency wasn't helping her nerves. The diner was a local establishment, a worn-down building with red vinyl booths and the smell of fresh coffee in the air. Maggie slid into the booth across from Sheriff Keller, who looked even more haggard than usual. His graying hair was more unkempt, and there was a weariness in his eyes that Maggie hadn't seen before. He wasn't the same man who had proudly patrolled Lexington for years. Something had shifted in him, and Maggie wasn't sure she liked it. "You wanted to talk, Sheriff?" Maggie asked, her tone cautious. Keller looked around, as though ensuring no one could overhear their conversation. "I don't know how to say this, but you might want to tread carefully with this case. Jacob Montgomery isn't who you think he is." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Keller sighed and leaned back in the booth, looking defeated. "I've known Jacob for years. He's done a lot for this town. Charity work. He's always been involved in the church, helping out wherever he can. People trust him. Hell, I trusted him. But I've seen things, Maggie. Things I can't ignore anymore." Maggie leaned in, sensing something serious was coming. "What things, Sheriff?" Keller glanced over his shoulder once more, lowering his voice. "Jacob's been involved in some shady dealings for years. You don't get to be as powerful as he is without making some deals, you know? I'm not saying he killed Emily, but I'm telling you, there's more to this than just the money. You might want to back off before you get too deep into this." Maggie's heart started to race. Keller's warning sounded less like an innocent tip-off and more like someone trying to protect Jacob. "Are you telling me to drop the case?" she asked, her voice cool but firm. Keller shook his head slowly. "I'm not saying you should drop it, Maggie. What I'm saying is that there's more at play here than you realize. Jacob has connections, powerful people, and if you push too hard, you might find yourself in over your head." Maggie's mind raced. Was Keller trying to intimidate her, or was he genuinely warning her out of concern for her safety? She couldn't tell. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a preacher manipulating his wife's death for a payout. There were other forces at work, forces that could crush her if she wasn't careful. She leaned back, her mind spinning as she processed everything. She couldn't back down now. She had to see this through to the end. But how far would she have to go? And how far would Jacob go to protect his empire? "I'm not afraid of him, Sheriff," Maggie said, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside her. "And I'm not backing off. I'm getting him for what he's done to Emily and for everything else he's been hiding." Keller stared at her for a long moment, his face a mask of indecision. Finally, he spoke again, this time softer. "Be careful, Maggie. That's all I'm saying. There are people who won't hesitate to make sure this goes away. Jacob, he's not the only one with something to lose." Maggie stood up, her resolve hardening. "I'll keep that in mind, but I'm not backing down. Not now, not ever." She turned and walked out of the diner, her heart pounding in her chest. Sheriff Keller's warning echoed in her mind, but she couldn't let it stop her. She had come too far. She knew Jacob was guilty, and now she was closer than ever to exposing him for the fraud he was. Back at the station, Maggie gathered her team together to review the evidence. She had all the pieces she needed: the financial transactions, the links to Robert Langley, and the details of Emily's life insurance policy. But Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing, something crucial that would make her case irrefutable. Her lead investigator, Officer Nate Dawson, brought in a few more documents. "I dug into the offshore accounts some more. We found that Robert Langley wasn't just involved with Jacob. He had a few business partners, criminals in fact. Their names are listed as beneficiaries on some of the policies that Jacob had signed with Emily. Looks like Jacob's been making deals with these guys for years, laundering money through the church and other charities." Maggie took the documents and scanned them quickly, her eyes lighting up as she pieced it together. "This is it. This is the nail in his coffin." She turned to Nate. "We need to move fast. Get a warrant for his arrest. We're going in." The arrest didn't take long. Jacob Montgomery was taken into custody the following evening, his demeanor just as calm as ever. He didn't flinch when the handcuffs were placed on his wrists, didn't show a hint of surprise as Maggie led him out of the house. "I know what you're doing, Detective," Jacob said, his voice low but steady. "You think you've got it all figured out, but you have no idea what you're up against. You think you can take me down, but I've got people in high places. This isn't over." Maggie ignored his threats, focusing only on the victory she could feel just around the corner. She had him now. Jacob Montgomery, the once beloved preacher, the man who had manipulated an entire town, who had used his wife's death to fund his criminal empire. As Jacob was led into the back of the squad car, Maggie knew that the battle wasn't over. But she had one thing Jacob didn't: the truth. And that truth was going to bring him down. Jacob Montgomery sat in the interrogation room, his hands shackled to the metal table. His calm facade was cracking, the cool composure he had maintained for so long starting to chip away under the weight of the evidence, now stacked against him. His usual smile, the one that had charmed the congregation in the town, was nowhere to be found. Instead, his face was drawn, pale, his eyes cold and calculating. Maggie stood outside the interrogation room, watching him through the one-way glass. She could see him shifting in his chair, clearly uncomfortable, but he wasn't panicking. Not yet. She had to admit, he was good. Too good. He had spent years building up this mask of innocence, of righteousness, and now that it was crumbling, he was doing everything he could to hold on to it. She turned to Nate, who had been reviewing the final details of the investigation. "This is it," Maggie said quietly, her voice tight with determination. "He's our guy. Everything points to him. The money laundering, the offshore accounts, the insurance policy. Emily's death wasn't an accident. It was murder, plain and simple." Nate nodded. "We've got him, but we need him to crack. We need him to confess. The evidence is solid, but his connections are deep. He's not going down easy." Maggie's eyes narrowed. "He'll crack. He's too arrogant. He thinks he's invincible. He's going to think he can talk his way out of this. And that's when we hit him with the truth." An hour later, Maggie entered the interrogation room. Jacob was still seated at the table, his posture stiff, his eyes never leaving hers. He had been quiet since his arrest, but now that Maggie was here, there was a shift in the air, an almost imperceptible tension that told her everything she needed to know. She took a seat across from him, not saying a word. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Jacob's eyes flickered, but he didn't speak. Finally, Maggie broke the silence. "You know why you're here, Jacob. We've got everything. The offshore accounts, the money transfers, the life insurance policy. Emily's death wasn't just an unfortunate accident. It was calculated. It was murder." Jacob's eyes remained cold, but she could see the subtle twitch in his jaw. He wasn't used to being on the other side of the table, to being the one who was questioned, the one who couldn't control the narrative. "I didn't kill my wife," Jacob said finally, his voice low but steady, the same tone he had used when he had tried to charm the town. "I loved Emily. I did everything I could for her." Maggie leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. "You didn't just do everything you could for her, Jacob. You manipulated her. You pushed her into agreeing to the amputation, knowing full well what would happen. You convinced her that it was the only way to save her, while you set up a financial windfall for yourself. And once she was vulnerable, once she trusted you, you pulled the trigger. You knew the surgery would lead to complications, that it would give you the perfect opportunity to collect on the insurance policy." Jacob's face twisted, a brief flash of anger crossing his features, but he quickly regained control. "You're wrong. Emily made the decision. She agreed to the surgery. She wanted to live. She wanted to fight." Maggie shook her head. "Don't give me that, Jacob. You and I both know that you made all the arrangements. You controlled the situation from the start. And don't think I didn't notice the transactions you made before and after the surgery. Large sums of money being moved around. You've been laundering money for years, and you used Emily's death to cover your tracks." He was silent for a moment, his eyes darting away. But when he spoke again, his voice was more measured. "I didn't kill her, Maggie, but I did what I had to do. I'm a man of God. I've built this town. I've helped people. People depend on me. You didn't help anyone, Jacob. You used people. You used Emily, and you used this town. You're a fraud, a murderer, and you're not going to get away with it." Jacob's mask faltered for just a second. Maggie saw the hint of desperation in his eyes, but it was quickly hidden, replaced by that familiar coldness. "I've done a lot of good in this town," Jacob said, his voice now tinged with bitterness. "I've saved lives. I've helped people find redemption. I built this place from the ground up. You think anyone's going to believe you over me? I'm the preacher. I'm the one who saved them, who gave them hope." Maggie didn't flinch. "And you think that gives you the right to destroy lives? To use people as pawns in your twisted game? Emily trusted you. She loved you. And you took everything from her, just for a payout." Jacob's face reddened. "You don't understand. You're just a cop. You're so small time. You don't know how things work in the real world, how things have to be done. I had to make sacrifices. I had to do things to survive." "You call it survival," Maggie countered, "but what you did was murder. You killed your wife for money, and you thought you could get away with it because you're a preacher, because people trusted you. Well, I'm not buying it, and neither is anyone else who looks at the evidence." Jacob's eyes darkened, and for a moment Maggie thought he might actually break. But then he leaned back in his chair, his hands still cuffed to the table. "You think you've won, Maggie?" Jacob said, his voice now tinged with a cold, almost mocking tone. "You think this is over? You have no idea who you're dealing with. There are people who will make sure you don't win. People who won't let this go. You're too far in now. You're nothing but a pawn in a much bigger game." Maggie's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let it show. "I'm not a pawn, Jacob, and I'm not afraid of you. You'll be convicted for what you did. The evidence is all there, and there's no way you can talk your way out of it." Jacob's expression softened slightly, almost as if he were contemplating something. Then with a slight sneer, he spoke again. "We'll see about that." The trial came swiftly, and with it, the town of Lexington was forced to confront the truth. The small-town preacher, who had once been viewed as a symbol of hope and integrity, was now revealed for what he truly was: a cold-hearted manipulator, a murderer who had used his wife's death to line his pockets and fund a criminal enterprise. Jacob Montgomery's trial was a spectacle. The prosecution presented the evidence: the offshore accounts, the insurance policies, the testimonies from those who had seen Jacob's manipulative behavior firsthand. And the defense, desperate and weak, could do little more than try to discredit the witnesses and claim that Jacob had been misunderstood. But in the end, it didn't matter. The truth won out. Jacob was convicted of murder and fraud, and his empire of lies came crashing down around him. The town that had once worshipped him now turned its back on him. His former parishioners, once loyal to the preacher who had saved their souls, now saw him for what he truly was: a con man who had used them, just as he had used his wife. Maggie stood in the courtroom as the verdict was read, her chest tight with satisfaction. She had done it. She had exposed Jacob Montgomery for the monster he was. And though the town would never fully heal from the damage he had caused, at least now, they could begin to move forward. As Jacob was led away in handcuffs, Maggie allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had come a long way from that first call to investigate Emily's death. But she had never given up. She had followed the truth, no matter how dark or twisted it became. And in the end, the truth had won. The case was closed, but Maggie Lawson knew that, in a small town like Lexington, the scars left by Jacob Montgomery's actions would remain for a long time to come. And so she moved forward, ready to face the next challenge, knowing that justice had been served this time, and that, she thought, was all that mattered.